All right, everybody, welcome back to our Policy and Practice Subcommittee meeting of the FAC. It's our first of the calendar year 2024. It's good to see you all. And we've had a couple of meetings this week. We had acquisition workforce and we had industry partnerships. So this is our third subcommittee meeting of the week. Looking forward to a great conversation here on the focus areas of the committee. And before I go any further, let me go ahead and take a quick roll call of the people I see here. So I'm just going to go around the screen and I see Amlan. I see Mark.
Present.
Great. I see Luke. I see Jenny. I see David. I see Nicole. I see Anish.
Hello.
Hi. And then I also see Troy. Great. Very well. So let's go ahead and get started. A couple comments I wanted to make. So we've had 2 meetings this week, lots of good conversations. We post our minutes. Oh, I also see Rich. Hi, Rich. Yeah, you'll need to change your name, the 3 dots at the top there. We had good discussions. We had a great panel on Monday. Thank you, Nicole and Ann, who facilitated that panel discussion. Lots of interesting information on the acquisition workforce side, things that are of interest and emerging there. And then we also had a great conversation with the Industry Partnership Subcommittee on Tuesday. And we had an innovation firm, one of those new entrance innovators, really talk about what it's like trying to break into the federal marketplace. So those recordings will be out in about another week or so when we put them up, and I would recommend taking a look at both of those. There's some really interesting insights from those conversations. So today I wanted to turn it over to Luke here real quickly to sort of get us started, and I believe it's going to be pretty much of an internal discussion here. And then I see a couple in terms of the public will have an opportunity for some comments towards the end of the meeting, but I'm going to turn it over to Luke to get us started here. Thanks.
Thank you, Boris. Thank you, colleagues. Always a pleasure to see all of you. For those of you I haven't had a chance to talk to yet, thank you, thank you, thank you. There was a huge amount of work that went into December. Our presentation, our recommendations, the write-ups, the presentations. It was a massive effort, and you guys delivered. And you know, I couldn't have been prouder to be part of this subcommittee, especially the way things came together right at the end there. It really was a massive effort. In particular, David, thank you so much for, you know, kind of leading the charge right at the end there and really capping off a great amount of work that was done by the subcommittee here. And so now we're here in our third act. And I think that's the climax act, the final act as we work towards. Yep.
If I could add, just to encourage you all, you did such a good job that GSA has already started working on one of those recommendations. So on the PFAS, so they didn't waste any time. So they are, this before the report comes out. So they really, you did a good job with the presentation, really told the story real clearly. And just want to let you know that's, commend you all for the wonderful work you did last December. So back to you, Luke.
Thank you, Boris. That's really good to know. And I think that's motivational and hopefully will, you know, carry us towards what we want to work through today. And the next couple of months, which is, I think, a meeting in May and our potentially final round of recommendations. Boris, do we have a date yet on the May meeting, or is that still to be determined?
It is to be determined. We are looking at both when most members can be available, but we're also looking at our senior leaders, Robin Carnahan, Crystal Brumfield, and then Jeff Kosas. So we're coordinating schedules, but we'll definitely have it worked out once we get the date. That's going to work for everybody.
Great. Okay. Thank you, Boris. So today's agenda, I think, is relatively light. We don't have any guest speakers here. I think what we had planned to do was to talk through some of the work that's already been done, some of the ideas, and try to chart a course towards May, which is, as you know, just right around the corner. I think we have three meetings between now and then. So I think the first agenda item will be Amlan, who will talk through, I think, some of the good work that he had already done and that some of us have talked about in conversations leading up to December and in the time since then. But I did want to give the subcommittee an opportunity to speak. If anyone has anything they would like to share, a fair amount of time has taken place since we last met. And if your organizations or yourself have done anything, or you have any observations or things that you're proud of, or things that you think that the committee should hear, it would be great to hear. I think we all learn quite a bit from each other. I love hearing about what's going on in Arizona and New Mexico. So if anyone has anything they'd like to share, why don't we just go around quickly and see if we've got any news. Mark, you've got anything wonderful you want to share over the last month or so?
I think I gave you a sneak preview of what's happening, but New Mexico's looking at PFAS, which I'm sure David is pretty happy about too. I don't know how many other states are, but we are trying to set up some regulations to control that and to have some kind of disclaimer or labeling. So that's exciting news for us. Thanks.
Thank you, Mark. What about you, Jenny? Has the EPA done anything recently you want to talk about?
Well, the EPA as a whole has done quite a bit. I don't think too much to cover here, but in the kind of products realm, I oversee our P2 pollution prevention grants program, and I'm looking at setting up some webinars that look at this, and one of them should touch on PFAS. So, yeah, we're just starting to look at that, and I can circle back when that has been announced. Mark and others might find that of interest too. Thanks.
Terrific. Thank you, Jenny. I know my organization would be interested too. Anish, how about you? Any updates? Any news to share?
Nothing major. Happy New Year, everybody, and looking forward to this third act, as you guys put it.
Great. Thank you. How about you, Nicole?
Sorry, it's great to see everyone. It's great to be working together again. I definitely appreciate the final act sentiment, because within acquisition workforce, we've got our fists in the air then saying, go big or go home. And so it's just fantastic to be part of the momentum. And in December, our group, the Sustainable Purchasing Research Initiative, where I serve as director, won the President's Award for Sustainability at ASU. So that was a really nice pat on our back about the importance of sustainable procurement at ASU. And with that in mind, we are working with the university to help them assess their Scope 3 emissions across the university. And an interesting anecdote that connects with the work that this subcommittee is doing: we are looking at partnering with EcoVadis as the primary organization to help us think this through. So there are some interesting complementarities that are moving forward within this space.
Great. Thank you, Nicole. Nigel, how about you?
Just ditto with everyone else, looking forward to 2024 and what we're able to accomplish in this next phase.
Thanks, Nigel. Rich Butel.
Well, what Nigel said. Also, I do note that the Armed Services Committees are now actively soliciting policy inputs for the next round of the National Defense Authorization Act. I know we don't lobby per se, but we might want to think about throwing either some harmonization ideas, because DoD is moving forward on a lot of these ideas of its own accord, and just making sure we stay aligned with those guys. So that's it.
Terrific. Amlan.
I'm here. The year has started, and I'm delighted that everybody is here, and we're still working on this cool stuff. So nothing new.
Wonderful. David.
Good, Luke. Happy New Year, everybody. Good to see you. It did seem like forever since we did our mad dash to get the recommendations out in early December. And I wanted, at least on the PFAS, Boris, thank you for letting us know about the action on the PFAS recommendation. I want to thank Jenny and Rich for their work on that recommendation with me. I guess today is we're going to continue where we kind of left off with that presentation with some of the work that Amlan had been doing or has been doing in sort of tech tools and in related areas. So, but for the organizations, there's nothing to report that affects this subcommittee. Jenny talked about lots of things EPA are doing. I'm watching those very carefully because they have lots of intersections with the recycling industry. I don't know, Jenny, is the rulemaking still open on safer choice and sort of how that might change over time, or is that done, and sort of what's the timing of that? I may put you on the spot, sorry.
I was just wondering what the timing is. That's for our updates to the safer choice standard. I don't think it's closed yet, but I can look up the date for you.
Okay, because I know that that has been mentioned in a variety of things that we've discussed, on labels and things like that, which might get raised today, later on. So I'll give the floor back to you, Luke. Thanks.
Thank you, David. So I think I'm going to cede the floor myself to Amlan, who's going to kind of lead our next phase of our discussion. I think what we should probably all keep in mind here is we would love to work towards, at least one, fantastic, groundbreaking recommendation in May. And I think, with some of the work that Amlan's done, talking through some of the ideas, coming up with a curriculum of folks we can talk to in the meantime, leading up towards May, we should just kind of keep in mind what is it we want to deliver on as our potentially final, but third act of this here subcommittee. So with that, Amlan, the floor is yours, my friend.
Thank you. May I share the screen, please?
Yep.
Okay, so thank you very much, Luke, and thank you everybody for being here today. I'm just going to be touching on some of the stuff that we kind of started working on last fall, and then fall became this craziness altogether. So I did write up a document, and we had a few discussions. Nicole and I we had some good discussions on that, and I touched on it, Stacy as well. So this is made a round of discussion, and so I've heard back from some of the subcommittee members on I've heard back on some of the subcommittee members on what their opinions are, and try to incorporate that. So as a first pass in the first round, and so moving forward, so what is tools and technology? We've had some discussions on that, and what would the recommendations look like? So I'm going to go through, and I put together 4 recommendations in the original document, and then as I was preparing for today, I was like, this is probably really like 3 recommendations, or like 1 major recommendation, a couple of supporting recommendations. So as I go through that, I recognize that we can probably, I'm looking forward to all your inputs, and we can probably do a little bit more work on it as we go. But definitely, I think some of the content of it is all in this presentation, and so I'll be trying to get that across to you. So before we start out, the heart of what I'm going to be talking about is what I'm referring to as a principle-based framework, right? And why a principle-based framework? So why do we need a principle-based framework? So in the process of doing this, what I did was I went and did a little survey of what are all the different tools that are being used right now in federal procurement, and looked at EPA, looked at GSA, looked at the Green Owl, and I have that all written up. It's part of an appendix on what are all these different tools? What are the different methods being used? 3 things jump out. One is there are multiple tools in sustainability space, and there a lot of them are reporting a subset of what sustainability criteria are. So example is that, of course, we've talked about PFAS. PFAS is one criteria within the sustainability umbrella. Greenhouse gases are another criteria within the sustainability umbrella. And oftentimes, a tool that reports one doesn't report the other, and so on, right? Water, freshwater reuse, impact on water resources. So often there is rarely any one particular tool that's doing all of it. And of course, we can come back to whether we want that. But generally speaking, there is sustainability, and there seems to be various efforts within the sustainability umbrella. So there is some reporting here, some reporting there, which then takes us to the next question: is like, where is this reporting coming from, right? And we find that it's a mix of certifications, assessments, green, red lists. Like here is a list of stuff that you shouldn't be on this list. If you're on this list, we won't buy from you. Or here's a third party, and we have an EPA has a list of third parties that are quote unquote trusted, but like these, oftentimes some of these third parties have very good standards in place that are ANSI standards. Sometimes it's difficult to actually see where the third party is coming from. Generally speaking, there is no uniform scientifically verifiable framework. And a lot of the certifications are quantitative. Sometimes they're based on self-reporting. So generally speaking, there's like a mishmash of many different things going on, all coming from the right place, all coming with great intentions. But generally speaking, one thing that is also that jumps out is like, well, should we be picking tools, or should we be picking, like, for example, would the federal government ever go and say, we're going to use Microsoft Excel and nothing else, right? That's probably not a great thing to do. It might be a better idea to say, we want to use spreadsheets that allow us the capability to do this, 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 and this, right? And hence the idea of a principle-based framework. Like, what would those principles be? And then once in the procurement space, we can come up with a set of principles on what, again, not instead of saying we want Excel, we say we want a spreadsheet that allows for calculations, that allows for graphing, that allows for data entry, and that allows for data analysis. So if you can set those principles and then translate that into requirements, we're suddenly in a space where we can allow for a variety of different rules, but also be able to meet our needs differently. So a little bit of context, where is all this coming from? In terms of policy priorities right now with IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, and a lot of what we're seeing through the IRA, there's been a huge push towards life cycle assessment-based instruments. And this is, an area that a lot of industries have already been working on. There's been a strong emphasis in Europe. And so there are already some fairly mature instruments in there. And when I say mature, there's always room for improvement, but there are already some mature instruments in there. There is a fair amount of money through IRA supporting the development of this at the industry level, encouraging federal and state level, federal government as well as state level agencies to do that. So there's a whole plethora of BICLEAN related legislation at the state levels that are already in place that, I think there are 6 states at this point. There is a federal BICLEAN conversation going on that has come up with various or at least coming up with what potentially could look like requirements within the contractual space. And already in use right now is EPA's interim determination that came out December of 2022 for selecting quote unquote substantially low carbon construction materials. And I say quote unquote because that substantially low carbon is directly out of the IRA language, and there's been a lot of discussion on what that means. And right now we're using EPA's interim determination. Now, recognize that, again, going back to my very first point about different tools doing different sustainability criteria, a lot of the policy priorities right now are being, strictly speaking, driven by decarbonization, a push towards decarbonizing our different construction materials industries. Now, that, again, I do want to point out, that, again, remains one criteria. However, what we are learning through this process or through this experience is that there are ways in which we can use these scientifically verifiable frameworks. And so there has been a movement towards a lot of industries, a lot of highly polluting industries taking on these methods and measures.
Amlan, can I stop you for a second? Do you mind if we ask questions, or do you want us to wait until the end?
Interrupt me at whatever point. Of course.
Great. Okay, so I'll just comment that you're absolutely speaking my language, and when you lay out the complex world in which we live in as procurement professionals, and the often difficult to navigate number of certifications, assessments, the lists, it is an overwhelming amount of data and tools available to a procurement professional and who often lacks the expertise to figure out which one to use on any particular purchase. So it is, I totally understand and get the problem that's being pitched here. When you say a principles-based framework, is that an industry term, or is that something that you think, because I can picture it and it makes sense to me, but is that something that's like recognized somewhere? Is it statutory? Is it regulatory, or is that just kind of the term that you came up with for this approach?
I made it up on a flight from somewhere to somewhere. But
it's good. I like it.
but the reason, and I'll get to it, and of course we can play with it, we can make it whatever we want. The reason I call it a principles-based framework is that we really want, again, going back to the Excel example, is that we want to, if we have a set of principles that we all can come to a consensus on, then suddenly going back to, and I'll talk about this right at the end, when we talk about our procurement professionals, but really our, this, because again, when you're looking at something like this, it's not just the point of procurement at which sustainability happens. Sustainability happens across the entire design, procurement, and the life of that product, or how it impacts the lives of people who use the product. So really, realistically speaking, if we have a principles-based framework, that can then, we can do a real life cycle of that decision-making impact as well. And so that's where I thought about the principles-based framework. And of course, we focus it towards the procurement interaction, because it's that the procurement interaction that we're making our selections. But to answer your question, no, I made it up.
Thank you. Well done.
Thank you. So now the question, of course, is, and one of Nicole's comments last fall was like, well, what does this principle-based framework look like? What does it mean? And so, I went through the text, and, texts are what they are, texts. So a little hashing out of that as I was putting together this presentation, like, what would that even look like, right? So again, the goal is we don't want to select specific tools or technologies. We actually really want to create a set of principles that can be used at different, as I pointed out, different points in the decision-making timeline, and realistically, in a way, also help us. Like, for example, if you're designing a particular product, right, and the principles on which that would allow the product, or would make it a preferably procured product, well, you can use the same set of principles to influence your design. So in the long run, we end up with a set of our entire product space being more sustainable, right? So how do we create those, and what do those look like, right? So first and foremost, and this is kind of like very critical, and this reflects some of the other recommendations we heard in December, is use of a quantitative, objective, and based on scientifically defensible methods, right? And so I stopped short of literally calling out life cycle assessment-based methods. And again, one of the reasons is that, well, anything you do that is scientific, that has to be observable, based on observable data, based on third-party review, which of course then brings in, if it is quantifiable, independent third-party review. This is to reflect some of what we're hearing in Europe with their there has been a recent EU directive on how to stop "quote unquote" greenwashing. And again, in this space, especially the world we're moving into, if we are going to be using any of this kind of information in the marketplace, where there is probably going to be losers and winners, we are also making ourselves very, very vulnerable to legal ramifications, especially on public contracts, where like it could be questioned. Well, why is this bad? You say this, you're using this criteria. Show me why this criteria is actually valid. Well, there you go. This is where we need to have that infrastructure of trust, where we can take this, where if any of the stuff goes to court, which again, off the record, it's almost certainly going to, because of the history and record in this area. If that happens, well, we need to make sure that that we reflect best practices in the industry, best performance standards. We're reflecting, there is direct independent review that can continue to be reviewed, that there exists that point of transparency. And at any given point, we can fall back on standards. And so that's ISO standards, the EN standards, the European versions of ISO standards. There are ANSI standards at home, right? And of course, as we're also going through this, there are, the development of these standards further within the American procurement community. Move towards a reporting on all dimensions of sustainability for high impact product categories. Again, the thing is, if, depending on what you're buying, what are all the product categories, or for a given product category, what are all the major impacts we're seeing? So for certain product categories, for example, we know water is a major impact. There's a major impact in water, but you also recognize that there is a carbon impact. So the question is, and this is again the reason to fall back on life cycle assessment based methods, because you can use life cycle assessment to report on all of those categories. Now, once you've reported on all of those categories, a procurement criteria might be, well, actually, for this particular product, all we really care about is carbon dioxide, or all we really care about is water, because for that particular product, that's the leading indicator. But in order to do that, we still need those underlying life cycle assessment based studies. And then as we move through this process, how do you establish normalization, right? And so we don't do a lot of normalization in the US, but for example, in Europe, EF3.1, they have a version for normalizing where they look at impacts across different product categories and across different products compared to the impact of an individual European citizen. Right? As do we want to do something like that? Maybe we don't want to do something like that, but we could keep that option open on what that normalization would look like. And then if we were to create single metrics, so what would that weighting be? So for example, as an agency, let us say I'm an agency in Los Angeles, where smog formation is actually very high on my list of items, I would probably weight that a little bit more compared to some of the other criteria. So where would those weighting criteria come in so that you can still have a single metric? Going back to the ease of use for procurement professionals, you can still have that single metric decision point. So these are just some of the aspects and elements. I don't intend to put together the principle-based framework. I shouldn't, but right, the coming together of the principle-based framework would have to also involve all these different agencies. So which because different agencies also have different procurement criteria, which takes us to then who's going to be doing it, right? And so the development, this needs to be for it to be successful, this needs to be a multi-stakeholder participation. There has to be interagency involvement, and I can see how agencies might be even driving it. There has to be multi-stakeholder with industry participation. And the idea of the center of excellence that came up last year as like, well, where could we host something like this? And again, this could add to that, like really support some of that center of excellence recommendation from last year. That could be a place where some of this could be supported. Once that is done, it opens up a marketplace for tool development, because now you can say, well, here are the principles. Here is what you need to do. So anybody can develop a tool as long as the said tools can be validated and that there is third-party validation. So again, this goes back to we know the cost in the machine. One experience that I've had working with agencies, particularly in the area of transportation, early on in my career, where we were developing software tools, oftentimes a message you get back is like, that tool is very cool, but I don't trust it because I don't know the math behind it. And so over the years, we realized that actually really getting together these principles in Excel and showing the math in Excel and getting people's trust in those tools is very important, because I think that trust plays a very important role. So again, the principles-based framework followed by the validation really will help in the trust that procurement agencies, as well as our contractors and people who are federal contractors would have in these tools. And that trust is going to be very important for any of this to work.
Amlan, can I stop you for a second? So I would say conceptually, actually, David's got his hand raised. Why don't you go first, David? Like, figure out what I'm going to say.
Thanks. No, I really appreciate talking about sort of the normalizing and weighting, because there's kind of two parts of this. There is the quantitative science-based part, and then there's the policy subjective part. And that's the part which usually, and I think you gave really good examples of how you could make a distinction. Let's say if you're in an area with poor air quality, you might give a certain metric such as ozone formation a higher weighting than eutrophication of a water body or climate change or aquatic toxicity or what have you. But I think how to normalize and weighting is itself a huge issue. And the question is that something that the procurement professionals are going to have to do? Is it going to have to be a rulemaking from the government to actually set what those are? So I'm just thinking, trying to figure how this would work in practice. The other thing that occurs to me is that, and we've talked about this in other places, where a lot of these tools and things are probably more accessible to larger companies than to smaller ones who want to compete with their products. So the question is, how do we support smaller companies or disadvantaged companies in this big space where to play the game, you need to have these EPDs and things like that. And the last thing is, that also assumes that the person or the supplier of the product knows exactly how it's going to be used, which gets into what life cycle scenario do you use to show the benefits, or at least the metrics, that if I'm going to use this product that's going to last for 30 years, it's going to be in this place. I guess, is it up to the supplier to figure out how it's going to be used? Because I suppose the procurement folks could decide to use it differently than maybe what was laid out. So what's the interaction between answering the right question, so to speak?
Well, you've pretty much summarized my life, everything that I live, eat, and breathe. But let's go to the first question on the normalization, right? I mean, on the weighting, never mind the normalization, on the weighting. So I think what a PBF could do, and I'm thinking out loud because this is where we need that multi-stakeholder involvement. Because, for example, again, having lived for a very long in the Upper Midwest, where a lot of where on the one hand you have a very large, on the largest storage, of fresh water, and yet we're seeing a lot of that fresh water, eutrophication is a major problem, right? So in a situation like that, in an LCA, we do global warming potential and eutrophication, right? And when we want more recycled materials to reduce our global warming potential, but oftentimes a lot of the recycled materials that go back into some of our infrastructure that's in direct contact with water and earth systems, in fact, furthers eutrophication. So we are aware of that stuff. And so the question then is, but that's not the same, that's not going to be the same weighting when you look at Arizona. Right. So the question is, so this is in some ways, I think the principle-based framework can move that step further and say, for these priorities, this is how your weighting should be, and let the agencies, local agencies, do the weighting on their own. So we actually allow more for regional buy-in, and also we allow for regional buy-in, not just into the principles, but regional buy-in, like, we care about our water bodies. We do want to go and fish and be able to eat that fish. So all of that ties into a regional ownership of the system, right? And so I think that's my first attempt at that, or at my attempt at answering that question. And in a sense, it ties into the second part of that, is actually into the third question, which is like, and I'll come back to the second question. The third question is like, well, what happens like if I, as a supplier, I'm preparing my product for something, but the procurer is planning to use it for a completely different use. And this is, I have to say my depth in this is limited. My depth in answering this question is limited to the field I work in, which is in highways, transportation, over construction materials, buildings. And so these are places where the use of the material is relatively well known, and the contractor and the agencies are oftentimes involved in developing best practices around it. Now, if you ask me something about carpets, I'm just recently started working with floor tilings, but if you ask me about carpets, I don't know anything about carpets, right? So, so there is going to be some conversation around that, and that's again why we need multi-stakeholder participation. And carpets, we know, have significant impacts, and we are buying carpeting in federal buildings all the time. So what happens with carpet use? So there is going to be some conversation about that, and I can't quickly answer that question. Now, your part two, thanks to IRA, section 605.116, and Jenny's going to get the section number right, but there is $350 million, of which $100 million was up for a no-fo this last fall, where the entire, or at least one of the intentions of that, is to help industries develop capacity to produce their EPDs and life cycle assessment and robust data sets. And that deadline was the 16th of this month, last week. So I think, so there has been IRA funding and IRA investment towards the development of that capacity, so that and again, in the construction industry, which is so fragmented, where we have a lot of mom and pop suppliers and contractors, this is an extremely important consideration, because we do not want a situation where the large contractors or the smaller regional contractors can't compete. And when I say regional, I mean people who compete only in a couple of counties can't compete on a job simply because we've created a new barrier to entry into the market. So in a sense, some of that funding has happened, and we're kind of rolling forward with that in the next year or so. And from what I understand, a lot of our major industries who qualified for that grant funding have applied. And so we're very, very optimistic that market barrier entry, that barrier to market entry is not going to be there, and that is going to be available for contractors that funding is going to be available for contractors to use. Yes.
So let's take this to a acquisition professional. I'm a buyer. I've got a $10 million sidewalk roadway construction project. I'm trying to procure a contractor and concrete supplier to deliver. I think the world is catching up on low carbon concrete, and I think we're all getting a little more familiar with how that works and what the requirements are. Walk me through, as the procurement buyer, how a principles-based framework might influence my procurement, what touch points it might have, and how I might incorporate it into my acquisition.
Absolutely. And so going back to, the first thing to do is, so one way, again, I'm not suggesting this is the answer, but if I were to walk you through that. So right now, EPA's interim determination is that there should be industry averages around life cycle assessment-based metrics like global warming potential. There is no reason, well, anybody who's developing an industry average for global warming potential, you can use the same methods for all the other, like eutrophication, smog formation. You can do it for all of the other ones as well. Methods are there. The industries are producing their industry averages. So these averages now are available to you. And so if you follow EPA's interim determination, what they're saying is you want to select materials, so concrete, in the top 20% of that, of that particular industry. So if you, Stacy isn't here, but if you look at EC3 gives you some of those metrics already. So let us say you don't even fully know where EPA's interim determination is. As a quick first step, you could say, well, let's see what's available in EC3 and what EC3 is telling me about the average performance of this material. And so then you can say, well, where is my product compared to this average performance of the material? So you could go back into your specs and say that, and that's what we're seeing in a lot of the bike lane states. New York is one of the states. Port Authority of New York, New Jersey is doing that, which is where you are, Luke, right? But preaching to the choir here. But so you could actually adopt EPA's interim determination. Or you could go further and say, well, we're going to do that, but we're also going to be looking at performance, because I don't want my, I don't want my pavement to fall apart. So I'm not going to, because I can always create a pavement that has a lot of, really, really low carbon. But you say, no, well, my material has to meet, Article 23, I think, which is like all your performance requirements, and give me something below a particular carbon threshold, or, whatever those thresholds are. Which then behooves the producer to say, I can do that because I know where my low carbon cements are. I know how much supplementary cement materials I can use. So it sets that chain off. And now in the end, you get to procure a material and a pavement that has, a lower threshold on whatever that criteria is you're looking for.
So I think what you're saying is, because the EPA is kind of setting these regional thresholds, smaller agencies, public entities, we no longer have to worry about some of the complex inputs in making a low carbon concrete acquisition. So with the EPA setting a standard, now all I need to do is adopt that standard and say, do better than this when you try to sell me concrete, or I put it in my specifications and say, you must do better than this regional standard. Got it.
And to that point, the other thing that is also happening, and I guess there is a website on this, the Low Carbon Transportation Materials Program that's also funded through IRA is actually providing support to agencies to address some of exactly those questions. So yeah, so those building blocks are in place. And again, I want to point out that this shouldn't just be low carbon. We can take that effort and generalize it and see who comes in where,
Right.
for the electronics.
I think that's important, but I think low carbon is enough work has been done, right? That I think we're all a little more familiar with it. So for me, at least, I know it's easier for me to take something like this and apply it to that category where we are already using EPDs. We're already talking about global warming potential, and then to try to retroactively picture it in a different category that doesn't kind of have that standardization of data. So
Yeah, correct. And then also, like, for example, the PFAS stuff, right? Because I've been thinking about because we've given the PFAS recommendation, like what if could we apply it to the PFAS stuff too? And Jenny's here, so she can always help me with it. But to me, it seems like, yeah, if we were to identify specific chemical streams, we should be able to do that for PFAS as well.
got it. Thank you, Amlan.
Thank you. So then this is where we go to recommendation 2, where we get into a little bit deeper and say, okay, we're going to use an ISO type 3 label. And again, note how I'm stopping short of saying EPDs, because a type 3 label by definition requires third-party verification and must be quantifiable, right? And it does report multiple environmental indicators. Again, I'm stopping short of saying EPDs because you can also do PCF, which is 14026, and you can do more systemic portfolios. So instead of like, you can, as an agency, you might decide, I don't want to just look at one particular, low carbon or like environmental preferred asphalt. I may instead want to look at my entire portfolio of infrastructure. And that's where 14067 comes in. You could also look at scope 1, scope 2, scope 3. Again, a lot of organizations like lifecycle assessment-based EPDs are really good when we are looking at a particular product or a process. But when we're looking at an institution, universities, corporations, greenhouse gas reporting, which also uses a quantifiable method and can also be third-party verified, greenhouse gas reporting, SBTI, CDP, they provide us these other frameworks. Now the question is, can we develop a principles-based framework that adopts ISO type 3, but really kind of says, I mean, in the US, we've grudgingly taken on our ISO standards, and I say grudgingly with love, because we do like the ISO standards. We're involved in the development of them. But at the same time, we don't have, in Europe, they've developed their EN standards, but we don't have anything that really reflects our realities. And so the question is, what would it look like? What would that framework look like that comes up with a set of US approaches, which takes the best of ISO, takes the best of WRI's GHG reporting, SBTI, CDP, and really comes up with something that really serves our purposes for a country that's essentially a continent, right? And then also standardized review criteria. And I know EPA spoke to us last November about this. They're internally working on this. So again, ISO provides us reviews for conformity, but how do we, if you're putting so much emphasis on third-party independent review, then we should also, as part of our framework, say that we need to have some way to create those review standards.
So Amlan, can we stop there for a second and go back? Can you explain to us, because not all of us are as versed in this, what are type 3 ISO labels? What are type 2 ISO labels? What are the difference? What is it that you're actually advocating for here, right? Third-party verification, like what is it that in layman's terms, I'm an acquisition professional, what does this mean to me?
Right. So right now, a lot of the labels and certifications you have with EPA, that EPA has on their website, and like, for example, the Green Isle as well, a lot of them are what we would refer to as type 1 or type 2. So a type 1 declaration is when it's ISO 14020, that's type 1, where essentially you come out and say, hey, here is my product. I think it's mostly recyclable. It's got 60%, 70% recycled material, and nobody actually tests it, but we think you're doing this on good faith. We trust you. And you've given me a number that is very difficult to actually verify. But then you've also said that, look, in my production process, I use recycled water. I use all these things. And these are all the things that I'm doing. I think these are all good practices and great. So it's self-declared. There is no typical third-party verification. It may be somewhat quantitative, but qualitative is just fine. then you get into type twos, like for example, Energy Star sits right there around type 2, right? Again, Energy Star gives you some quantification, it gives you some assessment of where you are in the market, but it doesn't really need, it's still self-declared, it doesn't really need third-party verification. Then you get into type 3, where now you're following multiple ISO standards. So you have to have your lifecycle assessment has to be 140, 44 verified, which is a process verification, that you're actually taking all the steps that you need to take to do that LCA. Then you can have a data verification, which again makes sure that your data quality is measuring up to a certain standard. And then after that, after you've done all of that, it has to be third-party independently reviewed. And the third party, so for example, one of my studies is going through third-party independent review right now. I've been a third-party reviewer, and I've also had studies third-party reviewed, where essentially you send all your stuff to somebody who you may or may not know, and they go through it, go through all of it, and they go through as somebody who's also published in peer-reviewed literature, I think it's actually a higher level of scrutiny than peer review affords. And so in this case, you get all the data and all the calculations are redone, revalidated, and it comes back to you, and you say, okay. And they come back with comments. And when the report is published, all the third-party reviews from the reviewer and how those elements, or how all the concerns raised by the third-party reviewer were addressed, remains publicly available for scrutiny. So if so, for example, the asphalt industry LCA, I did that. But you can always go back and look at how I addressed the third-party reviewers' comments, what was addressed, and how it was addressed. And also, there was a calculation mistake. The calculation mistake I made and how it got corrected. So all of that level of transparency is provided. And we do the same. So the question now is, of course, so you say, well, this is all great. Then what's the problem here? The problem is we don't have that many reviewers who are working on this. And there is a small set of people who review, which means that oftentimes we end up reviewing each other. Right. And so then the question is like, okay, so we probably need a little bit more work on this to make sure that we can make this better. So, so we don't end up in, we're human beings have biases, and we don't end up with biases when we're reviewing colleagues and that kind of stuff. Again, the fact that it's transparent allows that level of check, but at the same time, I think there is a space for a little bit more conformity assessment, a little bit more making sure that this is the critical stop that makes these numbers believable. Therefore, we need to make sure that this critical stop is, there is a professional codes and ethics and standards of practice around it.
Okay, so if I'm going to reframe this as why this is important to an acquisition professional, or what we would be advocating for here, if I am conducting a federal acquisition for anything, the idea of relying on a self-certification, it makes me uncomfortable, right? Because there's no third-party verification. If I'm going to make an acquisition decision to select vendor A over vendor B because vendor A has self-certified that they've done something, that makes me uncomfortable, right? And I think we have actually talked about this before in prior meetings, the steady progression of, labels that go from self-certification all the way up to third-party verified. And so, as an acquisition professional, I want a type 3 label because I can, as you said, the data is out there. There's an independent third-party verification. Anybody can go look at it. You can audit it. You can check it. But it also comes at great cost, right? And so then I think, to me, and I think we've talked about this in other meetings, the question becomes: is that a barrier to entry? Are we then, we're creating, by putting, certain categories of purchases, by requiring type 3 labels in certain categories of purchases, we are now by necessity ensuring we're only going to acquire them from giant global conglomerates who can, dedicate the type of investment to this, to come up with those labels. And I'm picturing this in a world where there is no third-party funding that pays for these things, because that's not going to last forever, right? So
right, that's true. But so two things. One is, yes, we have the seed funding from EPA, thank goodness. And again, I'm not eligible to apply for that funding, but I know industries have applied for that funding. So it's great. And so that seed funding is going to be crucial. And I think moving on, what we've seen in some of the industries that already have tools for this, the cost can be reduced significantly. The cost is down to like a few $1,000s, and so per plant. So, I mean, at that point, that's where it is. At least I can say that for the concrete and the asphalt industry, the cost has come down to that level from even 5 to 7 years ago, where it was in the tens of thousands order. So I think, and part of it has also been innovation, part of it has been digitization. And so I believe in the next 2 to 3 years, this would become a low, it already is in some cases low, and in other cases it would become a low and a cost of business.
David?
Thank you. This has been a really interesting discussion. So I've been involved in other areas with life cycle assessments and determining carbon intensities of products. Can you speak to from the producer's perspective, how much sort of lead time will they need to do one of these things? Because if let's say you're doing scope 3, you have to do scope 3 as part of this. That means you need to interact with your supply chain and need to get things like aggregated data over a year in order to say something substantive about, let's say, the carbon intensity of your product. So can you give kind of a sense of what it takes to actually do this from the producer's point of view? Because you can't say, I don't think you can just say, well, I can do it in the next week, because the data doesn't exist yet or hasn't been aggregated yet to do the work. So it's not like you can just say, go and do it. It'll be some kind of lead time. Can you address that?
Absolutely. So for producers, and I can talk about asphalt, concrete, and aggregate. Those are the 3 industries I can talk about. For producers, we've come to a point, and again, I just want to be very clear, there are multiple tools in this area already that are all using the same rules and that have been all validated against each other. So I'm not advocating for any one particular tool over the other, because all the tools are doing a great job and they've all been comparatively validated. And so what happens with these tools is, if you want, let's say you're an aggregate producer, or you're a concrete, ready mix producer, ready mix concrete. So you can go and pick from one of the 2 tools, or 2 or 3 tools that are available in the marketplace, and you say, okay, well, I'm going to go talk to them, and they'll tell you, okay, well, whenever you have time, bring us your 12-month data for typically, again, it's your energy consumption and your materials use, and probably in some cases typical kinds of secondary materials or any kind of designs that you typically want. And as it turns out, again, all these industries have been doing this for a little while. As it turns out, this is information they have to keep just for their regular bookkeeping, because of, well, you have to buy your diesel, and you have to buy your electricity, and you have to buy your materials, and you know how much you're producing, because that's driving your bottom line. So what has happened in these industries, and again, I'm going to speak, these realities may be different in other industries, but broadly speaking, a lot of the data that we're looking for, we've learned industries are already keeping at a fairly at the level of granularity we wanted. Sometimes they're keeping it at a lower level of granularity. We really want the 12-month period, right? Because we don't want to, we want to make sure that ups and downs and valleys are appropriately scaled. So now the nature of life cycle assessment is such that you're looking for those energy and material flows. And so anything that goes into your process, you're probably paying for is the data we're looking for. And so if you were to choose one of the tools that is available right now in the marketplace, you choose a tool, and I think where tools differentiate, one tool differentiates themselves from the other tool is based on how friendly the interface is, on how easy you're making it for them to use that data, to input that data and get the EPD. The tools are all validated. So you use any one of the tools, you'll still get the same answer. But again, this is where the services come in, where tools or individuals can provide services on helping producers do that. So to answer your question, we've had plants that have gone from wanting to do something to getting the EPD in as little as 2 weeks. And and I'm talking about smaller plants. And in fact, the more mom and pop it is, at a particular plant level, I mean, that data is usually always available. It's just a matter of putting it together. Now,
Thank you.
in different industries, that may vary, but thank you. So that leads us to the third one. And so here is the thing. We've talked about data, we've talked about verification. And again, this is, yeah, and we can decide what to do about this, but I kept this on because this sounds very similar to a recommendation from last December. And I think this is in spirit, it is the same recommendation. It's just that I wanted to get into a little bit more detail on it, particularly calling out life cycle inventory data. Because right now, for example, our fossil fuels data in the US is woefully out of date. And we really need to update that data set. Now, strictly speaking, if everybody's using the same data set, you can say, well, okay, fine, we can still make progress. But over time, updating these data sets is so crucial. Now, electricity, we have good electricity data because the Department of Energy has done the work on providing us with good regionalized electricity data. You can very well estimate your greenhouse gas emissions from, depending on where you're in the country and which zip code you're in, based on what you're pulling out from your power outlets. That's great. And by the way, this happened to 2019, and this data set's been updated. But the Department of Energy needs support to do that. And so we have the Federal LCA Commons, which is some of my most favorite colleagues who worked across agencies to maintain these data sets and create the infrastructure for these data sets, but they've essentially been an unsupported mandate. And so I think calling out the Federal LCA Commons and creating that centralized US-centric data source is so crucial, is so important, right? And also making sure that those data sets remain open so that those inventories are not, and there will be situations where downstream products will need proprietary inventories, completely, absolutely acceptable. But some of these core data sets need to be open. And how do we create that support, create the support for that openness, while at the same time, for example, with the fossil fuels industry, there may be situations where there might be core proprietary information, but there are ways to handle that, and how do we go about doing that? Yes, Boris.
Yeah, thank you, Amlan. And actually, I bring Nicole into this conversation. I know, Nicole, you got a little bit, but I wanted to taking this point on the data quality. So one of the things that the recommendation in December from Acquisition Workforce was all about how do we enhance the quality of the data to help acquisition professionals make the right decision. So if you remember when we commented on the sustainable procurement PAR rule, one of the things that the committee put together as a recommendation that definitely consider that aspect, even though it was outside of the scope of the FAR Council, because this is something GSA has been thinking about, and they're beginning to do things to make the data more reliable in terms of what's offered in the GSA Advantage Sustainable Facilities tool. But the idea here is, would there be an opportunity to do like a part 2 to the recommendation that was offered in December, and that, what aspects of that work might be most helpful. I wanted to bring Nicole in the conversation just because this really goes to the work that the subcommittee did back then, and just wonder how this might connect to the work that already started. Because I'm thinking about it in practical terms, between now and May, what might be most helpful to GSA taking this approach. And I don't know if Nicole, you can comment on that.
So I totally agree that on a couple of things. One, that we could take a deeper dive on that recommendation and provide more specificity around it first. And second, especially around, well, in what ways do we improve the data? What's needed? In looking what's presented here, there are ideas coming forward that I think have some merit. I think that we would need as a next step to engage some of those acquisition workers and the individuals who we interviewed, not the workers. We were really talking with managers, Brennan Conway's team, Brad, I can't remember Brad's last name, but there was a panel of people that we spoke with who were deeply engaged in this problem, who have been thinking about how to move ideas forward within this space. I think as a next step, it would be really useful to connect what we have here with them and engage in a conversation about the best way to move it forward.
And let me add just a little bit, Amlan, before responding. Also, the White House has a new initiative called the Better Contracting Initiative that has 4 prongs, and one of them is data. So it's definitely on the radar of the policymakers even at the White House OMB level. So yeah, go ahead.
Absolutely. And no, I think that this discussion is actually right now, this discussion clarified something else for me, is that what I'm talking about, this lifecycle inventory data. So for example, when Luke is buying his procuring his pavement, he should never, ever have to worry about fossil fuel data sets, right? So in a sense, Nicole, the recommendation that from last year would look at more like, well, how does he know what to look for in an EPD, or how does he know what the difference between like a greenhouse gas protocol and what is scope 1, scope 2, scope 3. That guidance on like the data sets that a procurement professional finds is a little different. It's very, and it's like it's at the far end of the user interface of that data, whereas that builds on this data set, which strictly speaking, no procurement professional should ever have to worry about, what the lifecycle inventories associated with fossil fuels, electricity, and transportation are. But if this is not in place, the validity of the data that they're dealing with is, that becomes less valid.
Yeah, I don't disagree at all. What my eye is towards is implementation. We know what the outcome is. We know what outcome we want. I'm focused squarely on implementation, how we get there, and how we engage GSA in that conversation in order to achieve that outcome. And there are going to be certain friction points and boundaries. It could be outside their purview. So stepping into this and just having a sense of what that is so that they can forecast how to think this through, I think is going to be essential towards building a recommendation that can be implemented.
That's great point. And that's kind of like why I put the support feral LCA commons out there, because that's like an interagency thing. So I don't know if GSA can fund it. So there's going to be like implementation issues around it, but that could be a path forward.
Yeah, and I just added the link to the Better Contracting Initiative. So that's a little more information on that. Yeah.
And then as we go through that, once we have that, this is another discussion that happened within this group, is this integration of reporting tools. So we need open data exchange because, if you're looking at supply chain specificity, excuse me. So the data that's coming into Luke for his pavement, right now, that pavement becomes of concern to an urban planner so the thing is, each of these procurement decisions are kind of like these building blocks in the supply chain. So how do we integrate these data sets? So, and it shouldn't be where like, we shouldn't be passing stuff out in PDFs that can, so there needs to be an open exchange format. And so with OpenEPD, we're working with OpenEPD, OpenLCA. We've been using a lot of these open exchange formats a lot. And so the question is, how do we really turn these open exchange formats into like the digital component of this data processing to make sure that, we don't have more PDF and more paperwork flying around. And then also what this does is it creates this API for, going to the final user. What are those APIs for these data sets? And realistically speaking, what we don't have for environmental data right now that we do have for urban data sets is the public should be able to take an interest in all this stuff and be able to mine some of this data, especially for any kind of procurement that is done publicly and has an impact on the environment. You can do that with cities data. You can look at traffic data. You can look at a lot of different stuff. And what it really opens up, and we found this in the area of urban design and urban, particularly traffic, is that think of Google Maps. Google Maps has access to so much data that you and I can use on a regular basis just to try to figure out going from point A to point B or coming up with routing. Well, that's because we have so much urban data that is available in open formats. So what if we were to make a lot of our procurement, this is very aspirational, but wouldn't it be cool? Because how much more innovation could we have if all of this data was actually available it would also, by the way, and as somebody who works in the construction industry, which rarely gets any kind of major push from the outside, boy, wouldn't that be cool to have some of that innovation really pushing us towards bettering our performance. And then the last one, again, this is probably also a little bit of overlap. This is actually very close to my heart because as an academic in recovery, 20 years, there has always been the sense that sustainability is somebody else's problem, even in the curriculum, whereas what we're finding now is we don't literally have enough scientists and engineers to fill these roles. We don't have enough people to conduct life cycle assessment. We don't have enough people to review our stuff. Like there is, and tying that into law, contracts and project delivery procurement. And we're, well, at least I failed to put together an appropriate curriculum because there is a lot of stuff going on in the curriculum already, but the question is, how do we make this push? How do we call it out? Call out to universities, call out to, schools that are, and more importantly, accreditation agencies like ABET, right? ABET has had an emphasis on sustainability forever, but oftentimes those sustainability credits are filled by a social science course. Don't get me wrong, very important, but there is also a need for a core engineering sustainability curriculum, which is, again, it discerns itself a little bit from the previous recommendation, because this is aimed towards the university curriculum. And I think this impetus from the outside might actually be useful, especially if we bring in ABET and call them out. Again, who could do it? Where could it be done? Engage a center of excellence. That would be a great place to run this through. And 2 webinars to look forward to. Again, on this note, there is the webinar coming up. The EPA is doing 2 webinars. One is developing a label program for low embodied carbon construction materials. Really looking forward to it, because I think a lot of the lessons learned out of these webinars can very well be pointed to as something that an agency is already doing. And again, I get it. There is EPA, GSA. These are different agencies, but at the same time, if something works somewhere, why not adopt it? And so these are some directions in which there is movement that would help us, kind of like take advantage of. That's all I've got.
That's it.
I know, right?
Amlan, thank you. That was an incredible amount of work. I know you put your heart and soul into this, and I know this goes back to many months ago when we talked about, really, examining why we're here and what we want to bring to the table. And I know that you are very passionate about all of these things, and think that they're worthy of the committee, and you did a lot of hard work in them. And this was a great presentation. So I just wanted to thank you for doing that. David.
I had a thought, and this actually goes to Boris, Stephanie, anyone else on in GSA. With regard to these webinars and the topics, is that automatically included sort of in the FAR rule by reference, that whatever comes out of it is already things that apply or could apply to procurement?
I'm not sure I understand the question, David. You're talking about the FAR rule on sustainable procurement?
Yes, the way it was revised, that there are lots of references to EPA programs and labels that the topics of these webinars would kind of already be in the scope of the things that the procurement professionals have access to or could rely on.
Right. Yeah. Yes. And those are public offerings. And I don't know, Jenny, if you can chime in on those, if you have any thoughts on them, because I'm thinking this is something you do for outreach to your communities, right?
Yeah, I'm hesitant to talk here just because we do have a competitive grant program, and part of that grant program is developing how all these things fit together, which EPA will be, the application period just closed, and we will be announcing probably late April how that moves forward and what that includes. And so I feel like it is, it's a very, as you know, it's a very important subject area, but there are a lot of moving parts that are happening right now. And so I think it's hard to plan on not knowing exactly what the EPA program is going to look like until late April, as far as what's covered.
Okay.
Or the data parts of it, at least, how that's going to work.
But most of the
I just wanted to flag that.
But there'll be public access for the most part, the webinars, right? When they go out.
Well, we'll be announcing which grantees are funded and what
Okay.
projects are funded and how they all fit together and that type of stuff, which will be public and
Got it.
hopefully late April.
Okay. Thanks.
And these, and you know, again, the two webinars that I've put on, these are public webinars, and right, and so they're you know, I think they're going to be of interest to everybody.
Oh, I see. Those are. Oh, those you're saying those are the EPA. Those are not. Those aren't confirmed dates yet for those.
Oh, I registered for both of them. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think there might be a little. There might be a pushback a little bit.
Yeah. Well, okay. So when they get confirmed, I mean, I think these would be good webinars.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of fun.
I know. Yeah, and GSA holds a number, and David, to your initial question, GSA does also public facing webinar to vendor communities on just the different things that are going on. They use a platform called, I think it's called Interact. So there is a ton of things. In fact, I think I saw one they did last week, just to help the vendor community know how to engage with the government. So procurement in general, not sustainability specific, but general things. I think that one, the one last week was focused on cybersecurity, for example. Yeah.
Great.
Yeah, but great presentation.
Yes, thank you. Thank you much. So I think we wanted to transition now to a discussion amongst the group. We need to figure out how we are going to navigate over the next several months towards some final recommendations. And I think, you know, starting with what Amlan has put on the table, if I had to summarize, and maybe I'm oversimplifying, but if I had to summarize all of the ideas and concepts that have been put in front of us, it is really trying to flesh out a data and acquisition decision-making framework that is, you know, objective and, you know, can valid and credible. Something I'm trying to figure out like a big picture that we can focus on and how we can kind of narrow down on some guests and some speakers and who we can speak to that might help inform and flesh out all of these concepts that at least we've talked about today, and anything else that other members of the group want to put on the table for consideration. So that's my challenge to this group. Amlan, I mean, I know you and I have talked, you've already got some ideas about who might be able to come in and inform the discussions on these topics. Do you want to kick a few ideas out?
Yeah, you know, I think, again, looking at people who are working on the front lines of this, I would definitely like to have, you know, Latoya Johnson from Federal Highways come and talk about it. Again, because, you know, they've been involved in various efforts. I would probably put together a panel of Latoya Johnson from FHWA and Peter Arbuckle from Department of Agriculture, but he's, you know, he's leading the Federal LCA Commons. I think that would be a good combination, and Jenny has her hand up.
Yeah, I just have a question about the timing here. And I know that we, as a group, the charter will be up relatively soon, but I do think in the data realm that there are a lot of moving parts that are dependent on what EPA ends up funding. And so I'm not sure whether this is maybe, I'm not sure whether this is the best place to go given that, but I do see it as a balance of, as far as this group, we, if you did want to move forward, this might be the only chance of depending on the charter, but just with the timing and there being a lot of things happening in the background, whether it's a good time for that.
Are you speaking specifically about one of the recommendations or all of the above of the things that Amlan put on the table today?
Just specific to the data surrounding low embodied carbon in construction materials.
Got it.
And again, hesitant to get too much into it, but I just want to say that there are moving parts.
Yep. So do you think Latoya, I mean, I've met Latoya too. She's fantastic. Do you think that she might also not, this might not be a good time for her to speak on these topics either?
He has agreed to speak.
Yeah.
Great.
Just as far as where the recommendation comes in, as far as data, if there are plans that, as far as what EPA overlaps with data, aren't going to be, won't be, you know, available, decided upon in for another few months.
Got it.
But
and one of the initial, Jenny, one of the initial things in the recommendation that was put forth in December was to have a cross-agency group that GSA would convene to talk about standards, standardizing data. So, I mean, it wasn't a fully formed idea, but it was one of the things that was put forward as a suggestion for GSA to consider. Now, the report hasn't been finalized yet, and it hasn't been formally delivered to GSA yet, so we don't have that feedback. But yeah.
I think we've also had discussions about how the broad concept of data cuts across all three subcommittees, right? Were there discussions in either of the other two subcommittees about potentially joining on some sort of data deep dive?
We did touch a little bit. We did touch a little bit on the data topic. I can tell you, and I think Nicole had to go, so she had another commitment. That subcommittee is really going to be honing in on some personnel structures and more things for the acquisition workforce, like performance plans, job postings, almost on the OPM side of the house. So I don't see them really picking up necessarily a piece on the data from the conversation I had on Monday, but really focus on the workforce topic itself, more almost not necessarily HR related, but just a little build like the sustainability credentialing program, for example. So there was a lot of conversation on that. Is there maybe a part 2 to that? Because they delivered that back in May, and GSA is definitely moving forward with that one. So the long answer to your question, but I don't see it necessarily. Now on the industry partnership, and Nigel, you're here, so Nigel was there when we had this conversation. So we had a really good speaker company that Nigel was brought in, and this company talked about the difficulties of innovators breaking into a federal marketplace. How come they end up more on the industrial side? But we talked a little bit about data, although the piece of the puzzle that we were looking at there was more scorecards, vendor scorecards and that kind of thing, maybe going into that side of it. But the conversation on that subcommittee, and Nigel, you can add maybe more here, was more around a couple of things, whether we look at the large and small vendor partnerships, like mentorship. And then the other thing would be, are there some things that we could do to help create like a waiting room for new innovative companies that want to do business with the government? So that was a little bit of the conversation on Tuesday. And I don't know, Nigel, if you wanted to add any more to that.
Yeah, thanks, Boris. And yes, it was about really the tracking, because remember, our focus is identify, recruit, and retain smaller, innovative, non-traditional firms, bringing more ideas from away from, Washington, D.C. into the marketplace, into the federal marketplace. And there was exactly that, like the question of, once you're in, how do you get these entities that would not traditionally look for the federal government, but how do you make sure that you're tracking them? Right. So it's that data point is there. What is being developed outside, out in the world, out in the US? How do you identify those things? How do you bring those folks to the table? But how do you track it? And how do you track their participation? Right. How do you have some level of accountability to making sure that you're bringing them in and doing everything you can to keep them within your ecosystem? So I think that data part of it is how do you track and hold accountability? It goes back to some of the programmatic contracting tracking, procurement accountability with regards to meeting goals and things like that. Like, how do we make sure we're keeping track of all of those things? And then with regards to the waiting room, it's how do you get folks that are technically capable, extremely well versed in the climate change and sustainability space, doing innovative things, but are not necessarily ready for government contracting from a regulatory standpoint. So that was why I recognized when David was talking about, you know, how to address some of these things that may affect smaller firms that don't have the resources to do it. That's one of the things that we have to keep in mind as we're putting these regulatory recommendations in place. How is this going to affect the small guy who has great ideas, has great tools, great services, but may not have the infrastructure to do the paperwork of a, you know, large federal agency?
Right.
So that's when you start talking data, that was the concern that they had, which is, I'd love to comply, but how do I respond? How do I have the infrastructure to do all the things you need me to do that have nothing to do with the actual delivery of goods and services?
Right. And David, you were there as well. I forgot. Sorry. Yeah. But I don't know if you wanted to add anything else, David.
Oh, Nigel did a great job outlining, you know, those issues, and that was motivated my comment earlier in this meeting about, you know, how can small entities, especially disadvantaged or what the government can't see or they can't. Yeah, the thing one thing that they emphasized was, you know, they can't spend an infinite amount of time chasing resources. They have to kind of go with the ones that are most available, most likely to succeed, and with the least barriers in the way. So they wouldn't necessarily gravitate to government if other sources are easier, have fewer restrictions, and so forth, which is a loss potentially to federal procurement.
Right. So kind of, but that's, hopefully that answered your question, Luke.
Yes.
The other two. Yeah.
Yep. No, thank you. Go ahead, Amon.
Oh, I just, you know, my question was partly for Jenny, but, you know, I fully understand your reluctance, Jenny, given the situation right now. But everything I had on that slide has been something we've been asking for years now. And so I think it would be a missed opportunity if we can't get down to the details of what, you know, even independent of where EPA is now or whatever, you know, if you hear what I'm saying, this has been an ask from the lifecycle assessment community for a very long time. And so if we cannot bring this to the fore, I think it would be a missed opportunity.
Okay, no need to respond, Jenny. You don't have
Yeah,
to
I'm
speak
just
on
in a
behalf
tough
of the whole
position
agency.
here. So
That's
I
fine.
just can't.
That's fine.
I don't expect you to
Noted
say
for the
that.
record, Amlan.
Yeah,
Noted for the record. Thank you.
I have a question on that. So, you know, I get the sense that maybe sort of the low carbon material space is kind of the seed to do this more broadly. Is that kind of what I'm hearing? And I guess the question is we're just we have bad timing potentially here. Is that with our own sort of timeline to May, and certain things might be uncertain, whether we can have a recommendation that can start the process just to sort of create a seed of things and then have the ability to grow it over time, accrete, so to speak, more data to incorporate. Maybe an EPD will only cover, you know, cradle to gate, but then it can expand to the whole life cycle, and then it can take in more metrics. I mean, that would seem to me a direction that we'd want to go in, but how do we shape it, a recommendation to have sort of a self-sustaining process to get from here to some future we want to see?
Absolutely. No, I mean, and I've been trying my best to guard against my own biases here, which of course is tough, but, you know, in the sense that even if we want to do greenhouse gas reporting with scope 1, scope 2, scope 3, which is a very important tool as well that we're seeing in the marketplace, you know, it goes towards ESG reporting, which is also very critical, not directly related to federal procurement, but it is a critical area. So the question is, even for that, we need good data. We need the same, almost exactly the same data sets that we need for life cycle assessment. And the EPDs play into that. So this is really, we're looking at, you know, we're looking at what I would, same thing with science-based, targets. We need the same data sets. So really, we're looking at, what's the right word? A macrocosm of a data need that cuts across all these different tools, all of which goes into, and hence if we never talk about EPDs, and because, you know, that's where some of the policy pushes, and instead focus on these principles, because these principles will still need those data sets. And, you know, so going to your point, yes, we've had a lot of seed direction in that, and again, I've been trying to guard against my material biases, but moving forward, this is an opportunity to really expand across materials. And again, pretty much a lot of what we procure is oftentimes majority material. There's also services, of course, but even those services can be reduced down to materials.
Great. So I do want to give others in the subcommittee an opportunity to speak. We are trying to chart and navigate our direction towards May. What do you want to see that we haven't talked about or addressed, if anything? I know most of the people here have been very active participants. And so hopefully we've been able to float all of the ideas that have come up in our meetings and give them oxygen and sunshine. But is there anything anybody in the group want to put on the table for consideration or exploration that we haven't done so yet?
I'll raise my hand. And again, acknowledging previous comments just have me in a uniquely strange position. But with, the other thing that I think I would be interested in exploring that we've talked about before is just tools. So what tools can make it, and whereas an easy button as far as technology goes that is facing I think in a simpler level as for the procurement professional who's not a specialist to integrate requirements that are already in place even for sustainable procurement into their work and whether there's anything in the private sector. I know we've talked about that a few times, but we haven't really, made the progress there. So if there are any opportunities for that, but I just want to acknowledge that we've poked around a little bit, but if there's other opportunities for it, I think that would be
Agreed. I think
to explore.
We've definitely acknowledged it as a problem, but we haven't necessarily floated a solution to it. But there are some tools out there, innovative new entrants that I've come across in my day-to-day work. And so maybe we can reach out to them and just see if we can have a short presentation on kind of what's out there and what's being done. And maybe that can fuel some ideas and some thinking here. Happy to do that. And I know Nicole and I also had a conversation this week with some folks, David as well, that might be able to fuel that conversation too. Terrific. Good. That's a good one.
Luke,
Richard. Yep.
I would like to see a little more policy development around how we can better enable state and local governments to use existing federal tool sets and contract vehicles here through, for example, the big NASIO organization, which is the state and local government trade association. Right now, state and local governments can use pieces of the GSA schedule for a series of specific SINs, like emergency equipment and things of that nature. But how could we, the federal government is out ahead and has broader contract vehicles and better knowledge base for what we're trying to accomplish, and how can we make sure that state and local governments can leverage that expertise or utilize federal contract resources for themselves?
I think that's a concept that's near and dear to my heart. Mark as well. I see him raising his hand. Mark, you want to add something to that?
Yeah, I think that's a really, really good point. And why is it limited? And if you're allowed to use it, open it up to everybody to use, because I think the federal governments do a lot more analysis, and they're able to produce a lot more of those for availability at the state level. So I fully support that. And the other thing I was going to say is maybe take it one step further. The recommendations that we've already made, how about sharing those with our overseas counterparts? That's all I have.
That's a good idea. Thank you, Mark. So I think, so Rich, I think my short answer would be the Center of Excellence. We should use it as a tool to educate and inform state and local entities.
Well, hey, and that could be a follow-up to the Center of Excellence recommendation, which is already on the board, to Rich's point. So you could take a topic and say, okay, here's something the Center of Excellence could help with. So that's just a thought there.
And just another addition. So I think you hit the nail on the head, Rich. And I don't know if I've said this to you guys before, but the federal government tools, the GSA's tools, the EPA's tools are wonderful, right? And they make it very easy for us in state and local government to make to make more sustainable acquisition decisions. If we had to do our own research, if we had to put together our own lists, our own searchable databases, it would never get done. And so just kind of following that, making it easier and more accessible, not just to large entities like where I come from or where Mark comes from, but really the smaller state and local entities that might have one or two buyers who need this to be easy for them. I think that's a fantastic kind of concept to explore a little further. Nigel? You have your hand up, Nigel? Okay.
You're still on mute, Nigel, just in case you're trying to unmute yourself.
Okay. Any other thoughts? Anything else we want to put on the table? So I think what we'll do is we'll take some of the ideas that we've heard today.
Hey guys,
And
sorry guys, I was trying to get mute. My apologies, Luke. I'm sorry, guys.
Go for it. You're
Sorry.
on.
So with regard to the contract vehicles, I would love to participate in that subcommittee if we're going to work on that, because in the world of unintended consequences, what we're seeing in the federal space is, with these massive contract vehicles, and we're seeing this with Oasis and all these other new ones, right? If you're a smaller mid-sized business and you don't get on that contract vehicle, you're pretty much locked out. And so by its nature, as they continue to get larger and larger, right, that there's an inherent benefit that goes to the larger firms disproportionately, right? So the idea of what we're trying to do on the other committee, which is trying to identify these innovative firms to bring them to the marketplace, I don't want us to just simply use the most efficient, and efficient doesn't necessarily always meet all your best intentions. So I want to make sure, as we're making that available to others to use a GSA style massive contract vehicle, it's not simply just clearing the way for the same folks who've always been getting these federal contracts to now go in to get the state and local contracts.
Thank you, Nigel. I hadn't even thought of that, but you're absolutely right. If you've got the resources to land yourself on one of those federal lists, it opens up a door to you and makes you much more accessible. But if you're unable to get there, you're kind of locked out of those opportunities.
And your small firms usually, while they may not have an opportunity in the federal space because of the regulatory burdens and the barriers to entry, they may have a much better chance at a local contract, local government contract, or a state contract.
Yep. You're 100% right. Leslie, how are you? Anything you want to throw on the table for consideration in our third act here?
Oh, thanks everybody, and apologies for being late. I was double booked, like it sounds like a lot of you are. No, I'm just listening and taking in the, whoops, let me get off camera. On camera. I'm taking in the discussion, so thank you for all the good ideas. And I have an email I'll share with some of you as well, just that gets to some of the procurement issues we're focused in on at series, but happy to be a fly on the wall. Sorry about your Zoom issue. I thought I was losing my mind because I saw Skylar 4 different places and I thought, wow, I don't see myself, but I see her. But now I understand once I checked the chat. So apologies for not having my name up earlier. And for those of you I haven't seen in 2024, nice to see you and Happy New Year.
Same. Thank you much, Leslie. Appreciate it. Troy, any thoughts for us before we go to public comment?
Yeah, thank you. I think under the FACA rules, I am kind of the part of the public comment at these meetings, but just want to say I think everything that's been discussed today is very powerful. And I just definitely feel like the issues surrounding data are an area where we can make a further impact by building on the December recommendations. And I know it kind of cuts across all three subcommittees. And my sense is maybe the other subcommittees feel like, well, their bandwidth is limited and that might not be able to be their main focus. But I'd love a way to kind of dive deeper into what we put forward in December. Rich, you're bringing up a lot of fond memories with the cooperative purchasing. Rich and I worked on that on the Hill. It turns out to be harder than you might expect. There are various industries who come out of the woodworks who feel like that would create a lot of price pressure on them. So yeah, we made some progress on that while we were on the Hill, but it wasn't a slam dunk. But it's something I feel like totally makes sense. So I'm open to that. And then just kind of this is reminding me, I do feel like it would be good to help inform us as we go forward to get some updates on some of the things we've been briefed on over the past year and a half. I'm thinking of, Alliant, Oasis. We heard that FAS was trying to kind of map some of the category management procurement still, like where could you make the most impact in sustainability. So Boris, I'd love your thoughts on kind of like, how would we do that? Because it cuts across everybody, all three subcommittees. But everybody's like time in scheduling their subcommittee meetings is precious. I don't know if it's a possibility to get some of those updates by email so that we could just share committee wide.
Yeah, I think that's a good thought, and I can definitely reach out to the category management. That's on my to-do list here to reconnect with our friends from category management to see where that's going, and then share that with everybody.
Okay. Because I definitely could come up with a list of things like where I feel like, okay, we got this great briefing a year ago, but what's going on now, and could help build that list out and share with the other with others in case they have other questions on their minds. But I just feel like that would be a good exercise to go through as we head into the next few months.
Okay, great. Any other thoughts?
And just jumping back to Amlan's presentation, I feel like I was taking a lot of it in, and Luke kind of had a lot of similar reactions that you had about the potential usefulness of this, and I might have missed a little bit of this because I had to step away for a call, but I'm very curious, Amlan, to kind of hear your thoughts on how everything you're proposing might intersect with the recommendation we made last May for the maturity model and the follow-up recommendation we were making for GSA to kind of stand up a small group to look at how that might be launched. So throw that out as something that we might want to think a little further about too.
Yeah, definitely. That's definitely something to think a little bit more about. I think there is a synergy, but I think calling out that synergy is important.
Great. Thank you both. Do we have any members of the public? Or is that your job, Boris? John Reeder.
Nope, you're done. Yeah.
All right, John, how are you? You're on mute.
Sorry. been on mute a long time. I forgot where the button was. One question is sort of administrative. Do the recommendations that did go forward, are those available to the public?
No, not yet, John. Those are going to be, actually, there's a report in the works, and those will be published, and then we'll make sure to get the word out once they're out. But they're not, to answer your question, they're not.
But something was forwarded to GSA. I think you mentioned, Boris, at the top, and GSA's begun working on it. Is that right?
No, not yet. So it has not been submitted formally. What you saw in the December meeting is what GSA has seen so far, the presentation that was given. But there is a report. Remember that, like the report we released back in May?
Okay, I thought you mentioned
report.
that recommended that GSA began implementing something that was forwarded. So
right, based on the presentation that was given.
Okay.
Yeah.
My second comment is a little bit of a repeating, but you know, a lot of the procurement process in the government is necessarily complex, but not all of it needs to be, because the government also purchases a lot of manufactured products in furniture and sort of common things. So I would, I guess, reiterate that I urge the committee to consider that for those common products, that the government-wide contracts negotiated by GSA is a very efficient way to steer all the procurement for those products towards sustainable products, because they're done in a fell swoop across the government. All agencies can access the multiple award schedule. So I guess I would urge you to think of, maybe it's tiering or something, where there is some recommendations related to those government-wide contracts, and whereas some of the rest of, not some, the remainder of government procurement may be a lot more complex, where you get into a lot of the issues that you discussed today about certifications for different attributes. So, but there's some, I think, low-hanging fruit by looking at the multiple award schedule and winnowing that down. And I'm focused on PFAS, of course, which is something you could knock out from the MAS, but there might be other attributes that are fairly cross-cutting for certain categories of products, and only list those products that meet those attributes at the multiple award schedule, and you've solved a big problem across the government. Not the whole problem, but a big problem for those common products that are in manufactured products, and office building supplies and things like that, that are fairly uniform across the government. So I'll stop there. Appreciate you listening. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Back to you, Luke.
Thanks, John. Your input is always appreciated. So I think what our takeaways are is we're going to regroup with what we've heard today. We're going to try to put together some panels and some guests related to the topics that Amlan brought up, get some invitations out in the next week or so, and also see if we can do a deep dive on some of the other topics that came up here and see what recommendations we might be able to come up with. In the meantime, if there are any guests, if there are any potential speakers, if anyone has any ideas, any names they didn't want to share, please let us know. I think we are looking for, to put together a curriculum for the next couple of months to make sure that we are all, and as informed as possible on these topics, so that we can make the best and most informed recommendations come May. So be in touch. I have nothing else to add. David, you want to add anything?
No, just want to thank you, Luke, first of all, for sort of driving the process and the meeting, leading the meeting. Appreciate your earlier comments. Thank you, Amlan, for a great presentation, very interesting, thought-provoking, and everyone else for their time, especially the public, for their time sitting through our meeting. So that's all I have to say. I look forward to our next meeting next month. And maybe Boris could remind us of the date of that meeting.
Yes. So two things. Also, Luke and David, if you want to hold an admin meeting before then, we can talk through them. We don't have to decide today, but we can definitely look at that opportunity. And then the next meeting is going to be, so it'll be 4 weeks from today. So we're looking at February 22nd. Right, February 22nd will be the next public meeting. But Luke and David, we can talk about maybe something before then, as you get a chance to digest information and consolidate and synthesize.
Sounds good. All right. Well, thank
Great.
you all.
Well, if nothing else, we're going to go ahead and
Boris,
adjourn the meeting.
You'd mentioned that maybe May was targeted for a DC meeting. Any updates?
Yes, we are looking at a couple of dates in May. Right now, we're coordinating with Jeff Bristol and Robin Carnahan to make sure that they're available. So we will come up with a date and we'll send that as soon as we have one firmed up.
Thank you.
Absolutely. So we can go ahead and adjourn the meeting. Skylar, you can stop the recording.